Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first Angular team meetup put on by Bitovi. I'm going to switch over, and we've got our two presenters for today. We've got Jennifer Wadella, who's not the one who just waved, and the one who's waving now, and then Mark Thompson. And both of them are going to give us presentations on Angular forms. So we'll start out with Jennifer's presentation, Indiana Jones and the etc. Forms. So I'll let you go ahead and get your presentation set up, and then I'll switch back to you. Let me know when you're ready. All right, that looks good. All right, ready when you are.
Sweet. Well, welcome everyone to our first official Twitch stream. We are super excited to be doing this, and there's nothing more that we love talking about than Angular and forms. So here we go. I'm going to take you on an adventure, Indiana Jones and the hidden secrets of the Forms API. To kick things off, my name is Jennifer Wadella. I am the Director of Angular Development at Bitovi, and if you are an Angular person interested in a career, we are hiring. So feel free to reach out in the Twitch stream or after the presentation. I am an Angular GDE, a Google developer expert. I would consider myself an Angular archaeologist. I like to dig through client source code to find all sorts of interesting things, and a discoverer of API mysteries, particular Angular form API mysteries. So want to dig in and discover some of these hidden secrets that you may not know about the Reactive Forms API. Okay, my slides were laggy. So a big part of this, the formation of this presentation, is when we are in our daily life as developers, a lot of times we are just trying to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. And so that may mean going to Stack Overflow, that may mean, finding the first thing you understand on the Angular docs and just slapping that in and going from there. And this can lead us to sometimes not discover everything that is available to us. We might not be aware of all the different archaeological tools that are available within the Angular Forms API. So throughout this presentation, I am hoping to shed some light on that. So in your journey in the future from going to point A to point B, C, D, and Z, you can use some of these tools instead. All right, so if we start digging into the Reactive Forms module, there is a lot of functionality already available that a lot of people don't even realize. Some of these treasures include validators. I've seen a lot of projects where teams have set up to basically rewrite validators that already exist within the Forms API. There's already email validation, validation for checkboxes, max and mid length, as well as patterns and required validators. So before going to write your own, see if any of these treasures will work for your validation scenarios. Next up, we have value accessor directives. These are different ways that we can hook into form elements to get values and behavior out of them. So these are all built in. They're worth exploring in the source docs, and you can use them in many cool and interesting ways. We also have status directives. This is probably one of the biggest unknowns. So if we're talking about some sort of form, you might want to know whether that form is invalid or not. You might want to know if a user has ever interacted with it or not. And so these are directives that already come attached when you are using a form element and will do different things accordingly. So with our ng control status, that is going to give you access to whatever the status of that control is to display different things. Some of those things might include a class that you might want to show on a certain occasion. We also have form control directives. We've got form array name, form control directive, form control name directive, form group directive, form group name directive. All of these are different directives available for you to use in different ways to handle those different form elements that you might have in your markup and tying those in a way to be used in your TypeScript files. All right, so let's talk about some advanced form scenarios you might run into in your own journeys, and we will kind of use our different tools to figure out how to solve them. One of the very common scenarios you might run into is needing to change an input requiredness depending on the state of another input. You might need custom validation, handling all sorts of different cases that go beyond min, max, required, or email. You might have a form where you need to add or remove inputs dynamically. You might have a scenario where you're really trying to dry up your code base. And so you have multiple form elements that are used throughout your application and you'd like to make them a little bit more reusable. You might be consuming a third-party library or web components that maybe don't have all the adaptions that you need for hooking up with the Angular Forms API. Or you might be creating forms based on a JSON structure that you are getting fed from your backend. You might also need to sometimes have different forms spread across components or routes and need a way to access and connect them in an elegant way. So all different sorts of paths that your form archaeological journey can take you down. So as we talk through these different API perks, I want to you to have some of these in mind and start to think about, okay, what are the different ways I can solve these problems with these different API elements? So let's get into Form Archaeology 101. First up, we have our form control. This is your most basic building block to create any sort of form element, be it an input, be it a radio, be it a select, be it a text box. This is going to track the value and the validation status. So at its core, this is your smallest atom that you're going to work with. Then we have our form group. So this is a group of form controls. This is going to create an object structure where a form control is tied with a key value pair, and simply in a way you can group and arrange things. Form group inherits a lot of the properties of form control, so everything that is available on a form control will be available at that parent form group level. We have a form array, so this is an array of form controls, which you are able to look up those controls based on an index. And all of these extend what is the base class, the abstract control class. So if you're ever curious of different methods or different properties that are available on any of things, you'll notice that they all extend from this abstract control class. So this is really good to know. This is a page that I often have pulled up in the Angular docs just to be able to quickly reference and see what's going on. So if I want the value of a form control, I can get that from the value prop here. The same way if I wanted to get the value of a form group, I could get this prop and that would return me an object with those key value pairs. So anything that we could want to do with our different form elements, we're going to have access to here. We have our different statuses that are tracked. If a form is touched or untouched, sometimes we might only want to display validation or certain circumstances if a user has interacted with a form element. We have a value changes observable. Okay, this is a way that we can get notified the value changes of our form control, of our form group, of our form array, anything extending this class. We also have methods to set validators. We can clear validators. We can mark our forms as touched. We can make them as untouched. All of those different statuses we are able to control and manipulate programmatically this way. We can also disable and enable our different form controls or form groups or form arrays as needed, all sorts of things. So if you are doing any level of form development in Angular, the abstract control is your best friend. The more familiar you are with this tool, the more successful that you will be in your Angular Forms journey. All right, so I mentioned that ng control status directive earlier. So this is a directive that applies classes. So if you have ever gone to style a form element and maybe you want it outlined in red to show the user, hey, this is invalid and there's something wrong here. This ng control status directive is automatically applied if you're using a form control or form control name directive. And so this is actually going to append these classes automatically for you. So you do not have to reinvent the wheel here. And this is a common thing I see. You can simply hook into, let's say, this ng invalid class that gets added and style that to be red or whatever you want to do. So you have all these different things that are available for you that all you need to do is hook in your styles accordingly. So super pro trick. We also have validation available to us. So we have our very basic required validation, which is, hey, this needs to be there or not. So this is an example of what that would look like, where I'm instantiating a new form control. I'm giving it an initial value, and in the object here, I'm marking validators as required. So we're able to just use our required validator or any of these other built-in validators that are available to us simply through the Forms API. We also have pattern validation. So this is going to get you through a lot of use cases with validation if you need something specific. We can just pass in a certain validator pattern, a regex pattern, and that is going to handle that for us. So if you want to do some formatting around dates or something like that, using this pattern validation will get you where you need to go. We also have function validation. So this tends to come into play where you might have a field that depends on another field. And depending on what's in one of those fields, you might want to change your validation dynamically. Let's say we only want a field to be required if another field has a certain numeric value or is above or below that. This is how you can handle that. So you can pass in a custom function that will handle that validation for you and enable you to do those different things dynamically. All right, so that was just Archaeology 101, the basics, y'all. So now I'm going to take you into Form Archaeology 102. And this is not for those who are faint of heart, so get ready. Number one is there are a bunch of form utilities that maybe you have seen before in different demos, but haven't ever really considered. So we have our form control name. This is a directive that's going to tie a DOM element to a form control by its name. So if you were to use the normal form control directive, you would be passing in a reference to whatever that form control is. Well, this would do a name lookup, so you can simply pass it a string. This can help you in a bunch of different scenarios where you're wanting to do quick lookups or pass information around. Similarly, we have a form group name. This is going to tie one of those elements to a form group by its name, so you can pass in that string value again. And the same for form array name. So you can use this and pass in a string of a form array and have that binding in the DOM. And then we also have form builder. This is a shorthand syntax for creating form controls, groups, and arrays. Instead of having to write out that long, new form control and pass all those longhand, this is a quick syntax that might allow you to create your form objects easier. So if we talk about using form control name and form group name, we can compare these two examples. What we care about is we have an array of flowers, and for each of those flowers, there's going to be a type of flower and a color of flower. So here we are just iterating through this array of flowers, and then we're using the form control, and then we're having to access this by going into that flower, accessing the controls property, and then accessing whatever that form control is inside of that form group. This is can read better and is a little bit more understandable. So we still have our same form array here where we're iterating over an array of form groups of flowers. So in here, we're using our form group directive binding to flower. So that's going to reference whatever flower group that we are in the array. And then instead of having to type out flower.controls. Whatever we're looking for, we can simply use the form control name directive here and pass in the name of whatever that control is in the form group that we care about. So a little nice, a little bit more readable, can be easier to understand, and then you don't have to go into this chaining and go down into the controls prop there. So with name directives, this is really helpful because you can apply these settings to different groups. So like I mentioned before, we have that control status directive, and that's going to be applied to everything. And so you can get a lot of cool cascading benefits here. So let's say you have a form group and it's containing different form fields. And if one of the form fields in that group is invalid, maybe you want to notify the user that the entire group is valid. Well, everything is going to cascade up. So that form group, if it has an invalid form control inside of it, that form group directive is still going to apply that ng invalid class because something inside of it is invalid. So there is a lot of power under the hood if you understand how this API is working, and that means a lot less code you have to write, maintain, and unit test. So last up, we have form builder. And so this is kind of an example of what the form builder syntax looks like, where instead of typing out that new form array in the longhand, we call this .formbuilder.array, and it's automatically expecting that first array that we pass in to be whatever is going to be in this array, be it a form group, be it a form control, be it another array. So it'll just save you a couple keystrokes and make your life easier. All right, so now that we're through Archaeology 101 and 102, there's not even a 1.0 for this. This is just straight to form super elite hacks, what we're going to talk about next. And so we're going to cover two things. Number one, the control value accessor, and number two, the control container. If you've run into a problem before with forms, I would be very, very surprised if you cannot solve it with one of these two things. All right, so first up, we have the control value accessor. This creates a bridge from a DOM element to a form control. So let's say we have a rating star or something like that. Maybe that's not a typical form element, but we could treat it as one that has a value. We can require it, do all the things that we would want for a normal form element, like an input or a radio button. This is what this interface looks like. This is in the Angular docs. You're welcome to go troll. So there are 3 methods that you must implement and then an optional one. So there's one for write value. This is going to be called anytime that the value of that form control changes. We have our register unchanged, which we want to call anytime that that control does change the value, and untouched, we want to register anytime somebody interacts with or clicks into that. And then our optional one is set disabled state. So if our form control gets set to enabled or disabled, we might want to handle that differently, and this allows us to do that. All right. So if one of the really cool things when you start trolling through the Angular source code is you start to see exactly how all these things are built. So there are all these value accessors that are built that the Angular framework uses to do the forms that you see today. So if you're looking at a radio control and you don't understand how that works, well, it's implementing the control value accessor and then having everything. So this is the default value accessor. And so if you look at this selector, it kind of shows you what's going on. Okay, so it's looking for inputs that are not a type of checkbox, that have form control name, not a type of text area, not a type of, let's see, checkbox. So it's looking through all these different bindings. And so when it's finding the ones, it's going ahead and applying this. So we're implementing the control value accessor interface. And so that means, okay, anytime this input is interacted with, we're going to trigger that event. Same with, okay, if we're clicking into and out of our input, we would want to call our untouched event to let the control know that a user has interacted with it, because we might want to apply different classes to that. So kind of cool to see this is how Angular is working under the hood. And when we start to use patterns like the control value accessor, we're simply using what already exists inside of Angular. We're just having a core understanding of it. So this was a super high speed lightning look at the control value accessor. It is a very deep, very difficult to understand topic. So if you want to go and play, I do have an example of like building a star rating tool that shows implementing the control value accessor to make a group of stars act as a form control, as well as an ngconf talk from 2019. All right, so next up is the control container. So this is a base class for directives registering instances of form control, or ng control, excuse me. So this is a way that you can have whole forms stretch across components and even routes, and be able to access a kind of parent form to be able to manipulate and do the different things that you need. So here's an example where we have a form. We've got a couple different form groups here. We've got a first name field, a last name field, and the email address. And then we have another component here for app address, because maybe we use this address field over and over throughout our app. And so we want to be able to use this in a way where the information inside of this component, that form, is connected to our parent form here. And so if you look, here's our parent form where we've got a username, a first name, last name, email, street, city, state, and zip code. So these are the values that are going to be inside of our app address component. So we need to figure out how to make that communicate back to our parent form. So if we look at our address component, there are a bunch of different ways that we can do this, but from here, we want to get access to what I'm calling our OG form group, our original form group. So we've got our parent component, right, has that big form group with all the users' information. And now in that component, we have our app address component, and there we need to be able to reference the different controls here. So we need the city, the street, the state, the zip code. So how are we going to access that parent form? Well, one of the ways we can do this is by injecting the control container. And through there, that is going to give us access to the different ng controls. And then we can use that to say, hey, this is our original form group. And because we have that original form group, oh, okay, now we can access the street name control in that form group. Now we can access the city in that form group. So super powerful, super fun stuff. Again, very advanced topic, very high level overview. So I've got some demo code here that has a control container example, and then again, an ngconf talk from 2020 that goes much more in depth here. All right, so now that you are all becoming experts in the Angular Forms API, I would like to provide you an archaeology guide for some of those scenarios that we talked through earlier. So when you run into one of these scenarios, you can whip out your handy guide in the form of these slides and figure out what to do. So the first thing we talked about is if we have an input and its requiredness needs to change based on other inputs. So here are the different things available in the Angular Forms API that we can use to make this happen. We can use the value changes observable of our first form control. So anytime that form control changes, we know it's changed and we know what its new value is. We can use the set validators method and the dependent form control to set our validators according to whatever we want based on the value changes of the first observable form control. And then finally, we can use update value and validity method on the change form control. Anytime we set validators on a form control, we want to call update value and validity because we might have had a form control that was valid, but then we applied validators to it. Okay, well, we need to rerun that check because maybe it's no longer valid and it needs to be rerun. So all of these methods and observables available just from the abstract control class. All right. Number two, handling custom validation. An example is an input needs to validate against a custom value created like a user. A really great example of this is you are trying to book a flight on an airline and you need to select a departure date and a return date. And that return date cannot be before the departure date. This is how you would solve that problem. So you would get the comparison value. So whether that's the start date or the end date, you would create a validation function that looks at that form control and then takes the comparison value as a parameter and then pass that custom validation function to your form control. So anytime one of those values changes, you update that validation pattern dynamically with whatever property you're passing it, and then this will re-execute. All right, adding and removing inputs dynamically. So let's say we have some sort of menu because it's an order form because we are all still ordering online due to the pandemic. You might want to add multiple items to your order. How would we do that dynamically? So number one is you're going to create a form array. This is going to allow us to insert or remove as many items as we need with at least one form control. Then what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over all of the controls inside of our form array. Again, this is going to be an array full of form controls. And we can use our form control directive to bind to that control. So we can just do, control I and use that as our form control binding. If we want to add something new, if we want to remove something new, we have three different methods at our disposal. We can use push, which is going to insert a new form control or whatever at the end of the form array. We can use insert, which will take an index and insert it at a certain point, or we can use remove at, which will take an index and remove whatever control is at the index that you pass it. Again, all available through abstract control, or excuse me, through the form array class. All right. We can create reusable custom form elements. So the example again is, let's say we have a rating component and we want to use that to allow users to rate our products in different places. We can create a component that implements the control value accessor. That component is going to have that star markup that a user can interact with and click and touch. We will wire up our register on change and our register on touch method. So anytime that star gets an interaction from the user, we're transmitting back to the form control what is happening. And then we will bind that form control to our custom element using either the form control or the form control name directive. Similarly, if we want to assume or consume a third-party web component library, so a really good example of this is Angular Material previously only supported the template-driven API. We can create a component that wraps whatever we need, implement the control value accessor there, and then use the host metadata property to call change and touch methods on events and wrap that, and it will work just as expected in the reactive form scenario. All right, for creating forms dynamically based on JSON, we can do anything we want based on this JSON because we know we have our form control that's just our basic element. We've got a form group, which is going to be an object, and we have a form array, which is going to be an array. So we can use those three different pieces to build out our JSON structure as necessary. Then we can, in our template, iterate over our different form groups or form arrays using the controls property or use directives like ng switch based on whatever input type we need. And finally, to access form groups across components. So again, that example is our app address field where we wanted to reuse that. We can do this a couple different ways. Number one, in the example I showed, is we can inject the control container in the constructor function of our component and get access to our form group that way. We can also provide the control container in the view providers option of the component, and that'll allow our child component to automatically access the form group in the parent component. Or we can inject the control container in the providers option of the component, like the parent component where the form is, and that just automatically makes it available by default to all child components. I know I'm running over time. Sorry, Mark. Finally, best practices, pitfalls, tips, and tricks. I see a lot of code where people are doing a lot of map or transformation work with form values. You're going to have the most success if you start with your kind of end game in mind, which is typically, hey, how do I need to submit data a user enters to my API in a way that works? And then build backwards from there by understanding how form group, form array, and form control play together, and use all those to create the structure you need to submit at the end of the day, so you don't get into all this mapping nonsense and then again have more to maintain and more unit tests to write. You should also use the abstract control value method. You can pull values for anything. So if you have a form group and it's got a bunch of form controls in it, all you need to do is call the value method on that form group, and it's going to return to you that entire structure with that key object pair. There's no need to iterate over everything, and this is real code that I've seen in somebody else's presentation, actually. There's no need to do this. You can simply call it at a parent level. It's a big code smell if you are doing something in forms and find yourself reaching for event emitters. It is very unlikely that you would not be able to solve your problem simply by understanding the control value accessor and the control container and just being able to rely on the Forms API and never have to use an event emitter. So definitely a code smell if you find yourself doing this. There is a better way. Something also good to know is in Angular 8+, you now have a method called mark all is touched. So if you have a form group or something like that, and you're trying to, maybe somebody's moving through a wizard and you want to reflect that in the UI, you can call mark all is touched, and that's going to capture everything instead of, again, having to iterate over all the different form controls and calling mark is touched on each one of those controls. So nice upgrade. Thank you, Angular team. If you're on Angular 8, this is yours for free. A lot of people have questions about set value or patch value that they run into. So this is a method that you would call on a form controller or form group. So if you call set value, it must match the exact structure for the group it's trying to set values for. So let's say I have a form and I have a first name, a last name, and an email. If I call set value on that group, I must provide it that first name, last name, and email. If I call patch value, I could pass in just name and email, and it will try and match whatever it is. So it'll do a partial match. So that's the difference between those two. Another great question that people have is there's this reset method. And sometimes it does not know what it does not do what you think it does, because you think reset, okay, you think reset back to the initial state. Well, that's not exactly true, because it's not going to capture that initial value. So all this is really going to do is a lot of status updates. So it's going to mark it as pristine, it's going to mark it as untouched, and clear out a bunch of different things. So good to be aware of exactly what reset does so you're not misusing it. Another good thing to know is the control methods option. It's very easy to get yourself into a loop if you are emitting change events and then acting on those change events, especially if you're dealing with form groups. So if you say only, like, let's say you have a form control inside of a form group, you're making a change on that, but then that form group is listening for changes to any of those controls to do something else, you could get into a pretty nasty loop like that. So what you can do in this form control is use the only self option, and then it will only affect its status. It won't propagate that change up to the parent. And then similarly, you can use emit event, and if you do this, then the status changes and the value changes observables will emit. If not, they won't emit, and then you're not going to get into that loop. One of the issues that we run into currently with forms is the lack of type support. Nice lead in for our next talk. But one of the hacky workarounds you can do if you ever need. Can you guys still hear me? My headphones just died. Okay, cool. You can use a getter in a template and return that type of form array. So this is kind of a hacky workaround if you need it, especially if you have strict template type checking on, which you should. All right, so that was Indiana Jones and the Hidden Secrets of the Forms API. These slides are available online at hidden-secrets-forms-api.jenniferwadella.com. If you're in here, you love Angular, we are hiring, so feel free to reach out to me at jennifer@bitovi.com or drop a note in the chat and we will shoot you over to our recruiting landing page. Thanks everybody for joining our first stream.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Leave it
You're
open
muted,
if
Wade.
anybody has questions. Nope. Okie doke. I guess we will go ahead and move on to Mark's presentation then. I will swap out and be back in 1 second. Okay. All right, I think we're ready. Are you good, Mark? Yep, we are
Okay,
good.
awesome. Alrighty. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Thompson. I am an Angular developer and consultant at Bitovi, and I am super excited to talk about the upcoming changes to the Reactive Forms API. Before we get into all that, we need to understand a little bit more about the Reactive Forms API, which I guess at this point you probably should have a pretty decent understanding of it. But we'll go over some small details. And we need to, we'll also talk about why the Reactive Forms API needs strict types. What are those strict type changes? And we'll also go over some common gotchas. Before we do all of that, what does RFC stand for? Is it reactive form controls? Really fierce code? React fried chicken? No, it's request for comments. A request for comments is a proposal for change that typically includes a prototype, examples, explanations, and is community driven. Shout outs to Dylan, Alex, and Andrew for working on the strictly typed reactive forms RFC. Super amazing stuff coming into the upcoming Angular upgrade. Now, before we can get into that, let's talk about the Reactive Forms API. If you will need any other information or need the full story, I suggest going to Angular's site. They do a full rundown on anything and everything you need to know. But to summarize, template-driven forms are typically for simple forms and are fairly straightforward to use, while reactive forms are a lot more robust and are definitely testable. Yeah, so here's an example of using template-driven forms. You can see on my app component, I have a favorite color property, and then I am using the ng model directive on my input using the banana in a box syntax in binding favorite color. The model to view relationship here is that the component sends the changes on its property to the ng model directive, and then that directive is responsible for creating a form control instance, and then that form control instance then updates the view. And you can imagine it going the other direction from view to model. When it comes to reactive forms, it's a much more direct approach. On our app component, we have a favorite color form control, and we will bind that form control directly to our input. In this case, we're using the form control directive. And you can see here the model to view is a lot more straightforward. The component creates a form control, and that form control updates our view. All right. Now, to better understand Angular forms, we need to know the fundamental building blocks. We talked a bit about form control, but now we're going to also talk about form group and form array. And as mentioned before, all these interfaces extend the abstract class abstract control. So you might refer to any of these three as an abstract control or simply a control. So here's an example of using the form group. You can see here I have a colors form where it has two controls. One is favorite and the other is least favorite. These are the form control names, the key of the object that you use to initialize your form group. Those will be the form control names. You can see in my template, I am binding my colors form to my form using the form group directive, and I can access the child controls by using the form control name directive. Form array gets a little bit more complicated. We can create a form array in our component, which I've called favorite colors. But sadly, there is no form array directive, maybe in the future. But for now, what you'll have to do is you can wrap it with a form group and then iterate over the indexes of the form array to bind to our inputs. There are several ways to get around this, and we'll explore those. One thing that's kind of cool to note about form arrays is they're pretty ideal when it comes to adding and removing form controls as being displayed on the right. Okay, so we brushed up a bit on the Reactive Forms API. Let's talk about why it needs strict types. First off, it's tricky. There's a lot going on, and some of these things might not be as apparent as you might think. For instance, let's consider the form group that we were of the example before. You might think that the value of that form group is an object with property favorite, least favorite, and the values would be a string, and that string will be whatever the value of the input is. But this isn't quite accurate because when a child control becomes disabled, you'll notice that that form control's value is now excluded from the form group. And if that wasn't confusing enough as it is, if you happen to disable all the child controls of a form group, that form group is now also considered disabled. So now its value is all of the disabled form controls. And to top that off, the reset method makes things even more muddy. If you call reset on a form control, that value will become null. So I guess the final value, the type for our form group would be an object with optional properties, favorite and least favorite, which is also nullish. Another reason why we need strict types is because everything is always an abstract control. Now, what do I mean by this? When you're trying to access a child control of, let's say, a form group, TypeScript only recognizes that the child controls are an abstract control and not whatever specific control it is. In this case, favorite color is a form control, and that will lead to syntax problems. Also, because of the lack of strict types, TypeScript isn't able to verify whether or not that control actually exists. Here, clearly, the does not exist form control does not exist. I would expect to get some kind of type error here. On top of this, because TypeScript thinks that everything is an abstract control, I can't access all these specific properties or methods of the form array. And now to go back to why form arrays are tricky in the template, if I try to bind the child controls of my template, give or take whatever your TypeScript settings are and whatever strictness it's on, it will say that abstract control is not a form control. So you can't use that for the form control directive. Darn. And probably the biggest reason why the Reactive Forms API needs strict types is because any is evil. You notice here that my form control is dealing with strings, but yet when I try to set the value to a Boolean or a number or anything, I don't get a type error. On top of that, when trying to access the value, because that is also of type any, I can do all kinds of madness here. I get no type error, and yeah, it's very confusing to work with. So now that we talked about why it needs strict types, let's talk about the upcoming update to the Reactive Forms API. A prerequisite, basically, all the added types have to do with generics. If you're not familiar with generics, I suggest going to the TypeScript site, going to their generic side. I would search specifically the generic classes section, but anything in here should answer the questions on generics. Another thing to note is that this upgrade is fully backwards compatible. If you don't want to play the game of strict types, that's fine. Simply pass any as the generic type, and you can ignore the strict types, though I don't know why you would. All right. To use strict types, all you have to do is not pass any, and it will infer whatever the type of the form control is by simply passing a value. Here you can see it now knows that it has its values of type string. You can also specify it by adding the type in the caret braces. Right. And with this update to the types, there is one additional feature. They are adding the initial value is default to the form control options. As you can see here, when calling reset before this update, it always sets it to null. But if you pass this option as true, it will now reset it to its initial value. This is great because this is a feature that people want, but also this now can exclude null from the possible type of our form control value. So now it would just be optional or string, and we don't have to worry about null. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about the form group and form array generics. For form group, it's a bit not robust, but there's a lot of going on here. We have to pass the types of our child controls in the generic. This might be a bit verbose, but there is a lot of possibilities you can do with form groups because its child can be other form groups or form arrays. But yeah, even though this brings up a lot of syntax, I still think this brings a lot of value. Similarly, for form array, the way you can type form arrays is by passing an array of form controls, and you can specify the type of each of the controls. Okay. Now, why is all of this strict type stuff important? It's important because it improves development in a TypeScript project. You can see the benefits here. When I am trying to set the value of my favorite color form control, this is all great. And now, because of strict types, I can get type errors and not have to worry about running into this stuff at runtime or my tests. Likewise, now with strict types, when a form control doesn't exist, I will be notified immediately, and I don't have to accidentally walk into a mistake. And now, if I have a form array as a child of a form group, I can easily access their methods and properties. No more trickery, no more type assertions. It's pretty good stuff. Also now my templates when using form arrays, even with the strictest settings of TypeScript, I can easily bind the child form controls of that form array, which simplifies a lot of code. Okay, so that's all great, but now let's talk about some gotchas. First off, form array generic doesn't support tuples. If you're not familiar with tuples, I suggest going to the TypeScript site. Long story short, a tuple is essentially just an array, but you can specify which index is of which specific type. So you can have an array that is that has an element at the beginning that's a string, and then the second element is a number. Unfortunately, this doesn't work with the upcoming type for form array. If you try to type the first one as a form control with value string and the second one with value number, you're just going to get a type error. Hopefully, in the future, this will be added. This is probably the biggest bummer. Form builder cannot infer generic types. So form builders are very common to reduce on syntax. Unfortunately, as it stands right now, when trying to use the form builder, all of the child controls of that form group will be an abstract control and not the specific type of control that it is, which then, of course, will lead to a type error. So That's unfortunate. There are other issues as well involving the template, but I will leave that to the RFC documentation to point that out. Please go check it out. It's very well written, very well documented, has great examples, and a lot of good discussion. And there's some more resources that I found useful. At the bottom, there is a link to a demo with the typed forms with plenty of examples for you to play with. And that's it.
Cool. Thanks, Mark. We do have one question for you. Do you know what the proper pronunciation of tuple is? Is it tuple or tuple?
It's tuple.
Okay.
And I'll die on this hill.
There you go. Definitive answer.
Yeah, like quintuple.
Perfect. Alrighty. Well, I'll give it a second to see if anybody else has any questions. All right. It does not appear so. So thank you guys. Thank you everybody who came to our first meetup, and thank you Mark and Jennifer for giving presentations to help us learn more about the glorious world of Angular forms. We'll be back on the last Tuesday of next month with another meetup. Until then, thanks everybody. See ya.